How's it guys? Craig and Nick here again from Build a Beamer, and today we promise you a video with content and insight which we guarantee is not available anywhere elsewhere on the web. Is it possible that BMW actually has a fundamental design flaw on a pretty high performance car from their stable? I think there is, and we're going to explain to you why. For those of you guys who have been following this channel, you will know that our videos and feedback are almost exclusively interspersed with these stories about the cooling trouble that we've had with this car, and we found stuff which wasn't right, and each time we found it, we've thought we've been onto it. And I think many of you guys would be laughing, given the number of times where we've said we think we've solved the problem, only to report back a week later after the following race that we actually hadn't found the problem. So just to recap, we found literally from day one that when we had this car on the track that we would experience heating issues. In fact, it was so severe that by the time we kind of got to the second or third race and we were starting to kind of build a little bit of momentum through our own driving capability, we were in the summer, we were finding we really couldn't get more than about 3 laps done before we got to absolutely critical temperatures. And so we set about trying to find out what the cause was and to hopefully eradicate it. So I just want to recap what we've been through, and those of you guys who have followed this channel will have heard all of these things before, but I think it's important to get them all summarized in the same place. So firstly, we do monitor the temperatures on the car, firstly through the little hidden menu option on the cluster, so we can actually see the degrees and not just the stupid gauge which actually tells you nothing until it's too late. But we also log the data to our little Logger S logging system. So we've got pretty reliable information in terms of what the temperatures in the engine have been as measured by the car. We then found that we had cavitation damage in the water pump section of the front timing cover, and what that effectively means is a pump needs very tight clearances to pump effectively, and in this case it wouldn't have been able to pump effectively, so we thought, aha, there's the issue. Replaced the front timing cover. That didn't solve the issue. We replaced the water pump. We deleted the thermostat together with the Welsh plug in the head to ensure that the flow went immediately through the radiator and was not interfered with or restricted by the thermostat. We then went back to a thermostat, but with a new thermostat this time. We ran the car with the normal distilled water plus Mocool. Now, for those of you who aren't aware, a typical anti-freeze, anti-boil additive, a ethylene glycol additive, actually compromises cooling. Its thermal capacity is lower than pure water. So distilled water is good, is better. And then Mocool is one of the additives, a little bit like water wetter, which improves the thermal capacity further still. So we were running a mixture of Mocool in there. We looked at channeling the radiator air, so the radiator is completely boxed in to make sure that no air could escape through the sides. We also have a horizontal splitter plate to make sure that there is no possibility of air entering below the bumper section and above the bumper section, perhaps competing and getting some turbulence there. So we made sure that there was a splitter plate in there. We replaced the radiator. We went and got a new radiator. The old one, we put another one in from a different manufacturer, but still OEM spec. It had a slightly different design, which got us excited. It was a dual channel, but circular fins or channels, so to speak. We replaced the temp sensor. I mean, it's also kind of 101. What if we were just reacting to incorrect data? But the new temp sensor told us exactly the same thing. We put in a secondary temperature sensor. So the stock OEM sensor measures at the back of the head, which is in theory I think it's the hottest point. That's pretty much where the water return comes from. So we drilled and tapped into the head and put a secondary sensor at the front of the head to just check, have we just got a hot zone perhaps, or is it the whole engine which is running hot? And it confirmed it's the whole engine that was running hot. We played with the fan cooling map. The electric fan on this car runs according to a map, and as the car gets hotter, it ramps up in speed. Eventually, Nick had this thing programmed to go to full speed at 50 degrees C or something ridiculous like that, and that still didn't help. So we tried removing the fan entirely, just in case there was some kind of restriction to flow, because of course, once you get moving, once you're over about 30 kilometers an hour, the fan doesn't play a role. So we tried taking the fan out completely. We put bonnet spacers in, so we raised the back of the bonnet to ensure that airflow not only could get into the radiator, through the radiator, but get out of the engine cavity. That didn't help. We tried ethanol. Ethanol burns colder than petrol, and so we switched to ethanol. And it actually had a little bit of an improved result, but still nowhere near enough. And eventually Nick changed the map, and he was just dumping liquid ethanol, into the car. It was kind of a secondary form of liquid cooling, and we still couldn't keep things under control. We removed the oil cooler. The oil cooler used to sit in front of the radiator, so we relocated that back down underneath into the section below the headlight to make sure that wasn't robbing us of any flow and heating up the air. We removed the headlights. We ran a couple of sessions with no headlights in at all, just to try and get additional airflow into the engine compartment, and that didn't help. And so, being fresh out of options, we rebuilt the motor. One of the ideas being that perhaps we had a head gasket issue, which was only manifesting really at high temperature, high load, and effectively interfering with the cooling. When we tore the engine down, we were amazed at the condition. It was absolutely fine. There was certainly no head gasket blow. There was really nothing that led us to worry. We checked all the cooling channels. They were clean as a whistle. We rebuilt the motor. Spent a lot of time on the rebuild, particularly with balancing and the like. Put it back together. The new motor is great, but she still got hot. And so, kind of at the end of our tether, we decided, whether it was a cause or not, that the only solution that we could go with was to throw a bigger radiator at the car. And I was really reluctant to do that, because it's kind of a symptomatic solution, because we were absolutely convinced that there must be something wrong. I mean, surely there's no ways that BMW would design a car, the 330, with the known 170 kilowatts. People are known to drive BMWs in a spirited fashion. BMWs have been sold and operated in various hot climate countries. South Africa has been a testing area for South Africa for many years. We're at high altitude. We've got the hot weather. Surely they couldn't make a mistake with the radiator. So I was really reluctant to go and put a different radiator in, because that kind of felt like putting a band-aid on the problem. But ultimately what we ended up doing is investigating any other radiators which were bigger, and looked at E39 and M5s and stuff, and eventually and even E90 radiators. And I bought two radiators, one of which was the E46 M3 radiator, which I was not terribly excited about, because it is physically shorter than the stock radiator. It only it's about that height, because the E46 has an oil cooler in that space below, and so it's a bit thicker, but I wasn't at all confident that that was going to give us anything meaningful. So I was looking for a thicker, bigger, wider radiator. And the bottom line was that the things that I'd found and researched with what appeared to have the bigger surface area, I just couldn't get in without starting to really cut the car. And structurally, I would not want to be cutting things like chassis legs and the like. So we bought the E46 M3 radiator, put it in, but in fact before I put it in, I've kind of become so obsessed with this issue that every time I've got a radiator issue, I tear the thing down to try and understand what it looked like inside, what was the condition, but also how it actually operates. And so before I put the E46 radiator in, I set about calculating exactly what the cooling surface area was of all of the different radiators that we put in to see whether there was really any difference, and what I could expect. And so this first radiator, we pulled the end cap off, and I've already kind of given feedback on this. This is one of the monumental cock-ups with this bloody radiator design. And all replacement radiators, or the majority thereof, are sold with an option that you can either use it for an auto or a manual. Now, in the case of the auto, they actually use these lower channels here to cool the oil in an auto box. So there's an add-on external oil cooler, and there's a bloody water to oil cooling heat exchanger. And so that's what these last 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 channels are actually used for. When you use this radiator in a manual, you actually get supplied with a plug, a different length plug. You've got two lengths that this comes with. One short one, which allows the coolant or water to come out of this port, and a longer one which goes straight past the port and actually blocks it far higher up. And there's also a cross member, a plastic cross section here, and a seal, and it effectively blocks this off. So the water in the auto version can flow all the way down the tank on the far side. It can flow through here, through the heat exchanger, and it returns elsewhere on the car. And effectively this volume gets used for cooling the gearbox. For both versions, only this volume and this number of fins is actually used for cooling the engine. So you think you've got a radiator which is this big, but it's actually not. It might as well be shorter. So what I set about doing was actually measuring up the size of these fins, because your cooling area is not just your frontal area that is exposed to the air. It's actually the surface area of the channels which go through the radiator, and it's also got a little bit to do with fin density. But I just wanted to compare the cooling channel areas, and so I measured this up. You measure up, length, width, look at the radius of the turns on the end, and you get a kind of an approximation of that oval, and then you multiply that by the number of fins that you've got, and then you multiply that by the length or the width. Now, as it happens, the width is not really necessary to use because it's the same in all of them. Then I did the same thing for the new radiator which we had in, which has got the circular little round pipes, but it's got a pair of them. And interestingly, that radiator actually came up short. I think we were about 7% less cooling area on that radiator, though that radiator did seem to perform slightly better. And what I put that down to is it has an incredibly fine fin matrix in between those cores, and I think that compensated for the fact that the actual overall surface area was smaller. And then I measured up on the M3. Now, obviously I didn't take the end cap off. I was able to measure up using external dimensions with a vernier and whatnot. Not quite as accurate, but there or thereabouts. And I was absolutely amazed at the result. 57% more surface area, despite the fact that the radiator is physically smaller in that dimension. And it's because it's a bunch thicker. Because here's the thing, I mean, you have a look at this radiator from the top or from the sides, and you think you've got yourself a thick radiator. But look at how thin the actual core is inside here. This bloody core is literally the thickness of those channels. So, is there really still something wrong which we haven't discovered? Or did BMW cock this design up? And did they effectively underspec this radiator and not take into account high altitude? And remember, the altitude is a problem because your air is less dense, and so your cooling effect is less going over the fins. Hot climate and really hard work on the motor, as you would have in a racing environment. I believe BMW should be able to handle the kind of stress that we put the motor under the kind of race conditions we do. This is not a tuned engine or anything like that. And yet it's just nowhere near being able to take it. So I think, quite frankly, BMW cocked this one up. And in support of that, going forward now into our next build, we're getting started with the E90. And the E90 happened to have a leaky radiator, so it was a great opportunity to replace the radiator, tear this one down, and see what BMW thought a 3-litre engine should have in the new car. Now, I don't know if you can see that, but they're relatively similar dimensions. So height and width, the frontal area is very, very similar. But what you'll soon see is the thickness of the E90 radiator and its core is massively different. If you look at that, the cores here don't protrude, but I'm going to just kind of put my vernier there. This is the thickness. It's a 32mm core on the E90 versus this miserable 20-odd millimeter core on the E46. So I think that again just lends credence to the argument that we cocked this one up. Now, interestingly, the E90 has the same. So interestingly, the E90 still retains this concept with a seal and with a number of fins down at the bottom here retained for use on the auto car. This radiator is incidentally the original BMW Radiator. It was date stamped 2005. It's manufactured by Smiths and it has the BMW logo on it. And this end tank has the little plastic separator which seals up against this rubber seal. This one had the short pipe in it, which basically meant that the water could not get below this point over here, so the O-ring kind of sits over there and therefore cannot escape through this hole on the side of the radiator. When looking for a replacement radiator though, I wanted to see whether we could get something any better, and I found I had a look at I think 2 different radiators from one of our suppliers, and they were all exactly the same concept. And then I found at Incomex that they actually stock the Meili Burr radiator. Now that is also an OEM manufacturer, and it was quite a bit more expensive than the NF, I think it's NFH or NRH brand. But I decided to go and have a look at it. And what was quite interesting on that radiator, and we ended up buying that one and putting it in, but it's actually different to this. So it still has the pin, but in that case they don't specify it as a universal. They say it's for the manual car only. And the difference there is that this port here, which is where one would normally plug the automatic gearbox heat exchanger into, is actually closed. It's sealed. The casting, the plastic molding is actually closed. And so what that means is that once that is plugged up, despite the fact that there is still a separator, the water flow can still flow all the way through, can flow through the gap and up, and there's no restriction. So that radiator was quite unique and is unlike the original factory one in that we've actually now got the use of the bottom fins in the radiator. And we'll confirm that either with a thermal camera, but in fact you can actually do it by touch. So once you get your car up to temperature, you can actually experience this phenomenon. We saw it on a thermal camera, but you can do it because by just placing your hand against the radiator, you'll feel that it's kind of, your engine temperature is coming through here, and then down here you have a completely stagnant zone, and it just sits there kind of cold and not going anywhere. So yeah, that's our findings. So we don't expect the issue on the E90. If you have an E46 with cooling issues, put the M3 radiator in and don't waste your time and money chasing ghosts, because on this one BMW got it wrong.